Greetings and salutations, and thank you for clicking on the video. Today I want to talk about Linux Mint. I want to talk about its past, its present, and its future. And the reason why I'm doing this video is because I just recently, like 2 days ago, posted a video where I talked about setting up the computer that I'm using to do this video, and I talked about how I had to really, after trying a bunch of other things, go to Linux Mint to get it to work. And Linux Mint has always been the distro that just works. And I think that's one of its positives. There are also some negatives about Linux Mint. Linux Mint is making news right now. They are ruffling feathers in the Linux community with some of the things that they're doing. And I wanted to get into some of that. And before we start talking about Linux Mint in the present, let's take a few moments to talk about Linux Mint's past. Because what is Linux Mint? Why does it exist? How does it work? That sort of thing. The picture that you're seeing on the screen is actually a screenshot from a video that I posted probably at this point 5-6 years ago about Linux Mint 11. And this is Linux Mint with the GNOME 2 desktop. And I first started using Linux Mint way back a long time ago, version 8. 7 or 8 or something like that. So Linux Mint represented 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago a alternative to Ubuntu that when you would install it, it came with everything installed. One of the biggest pains in the butt about Ubuntu 10 years ago, 8 years ago, was the fact that when you installed it, you did not have any proprietary codecs of any kind. Ubuntu used to be that you would install it and you could not play an MP3 file. You could not play a video. You could not play a DVD. You could not use a lot of the features because there was proprietary software involved. Linux Mint, what they did was they took Ubuntu and then they reconfigured it so where when you installed it, all of that functionality happened right out of the box. They didn't care about the legal issues. They didn't care about all this other stuff. It's like, no, we're just going to give them those codecs right up front. And originally, Linux Mint looked and felt a lot like Ubuntu, and the interface was a little bit different. But other than that, it was Ubuntu with buttons. That's what Linux Mint started out as, or at least I remember it as being. And they did have some tools that they put in there that were Mint-specific tools. And over the years, Linux Mint is no longer a derivative of Ubuntu that is just Ubuntu with buttons. They have actually developed alongside Ubuntu now. So this is what Ubuntu 14.04 with the Unity desktop looked like. This picture was done a couple of years ago. I took this for another blog post or something like that. And this is what the Cinnamon desktop looked like a couple of years ago. So big difference in how the systems worked, especially for the user experience. When GNOME 3 came along, both Ubuntu and Linux Mint reacted to GNOME 3 in different ways. Ubuntu's reaction was to come out with the Unity desktop, which became the default desktop for Ubuntu in 2011. Mint's reaction to GNOME 3 was to create the Cinnamon desktop. Both of these desktops are, even today, based on GNOME 3. So what they did was they took the basic GNOME 3 toolkit and then they reworked it to give a user experience that they wanted. And both desktops have gone further away from the GNOME 3 world, but still rely on bits and pieces of it. So they do have that in common. But as time has gone on, we have really seen this divergence between what Ubuntu is doing and what Linux Mint is doing. And Linux Mint is not just an Ubuntu-based distribution. There is also a Debian version of Linux Mint, which I have talked about a little bit on this channel. And Debian Linux is awesome. It's cool. It's wonderful. I would probably use straight Debian if I did not need some of the tools that are available just in Ubuntu and Linux Mint, because Debian makes it difficult to install certain software. You don't have a PPA system. It can be difficult to get codecs and things like that configured. Whereas you take the Linux Mint experience, and the Linux Mint experience is drop the disk in, load it up, everything's ready to go. And for a certain computer user, a certain kind of user, I think that that is extremely appealing. I think that's one of the strongest things about Linux Mint. And this is one of the reasons that up until very recently, Linux Mint was my go-to for anybody who was starting in Linux. Give them Linux Mint because it's all pre-configured. If you want to change it, go right ahead. But you're going to get an experience that works out of the box. Jay LaCroix wrote a great book about Linux Mint. This book, it talks about Linux Mint 16, so it's a couple years older now. This book came out in 2014, which really goes through the basics of the Linux Mint distribution and tells you a lot about it. I don't know whether the inner core Linux Mint community appreciated Jay's book, because some of the things that he talks about doing in there, I don't think that they agree with or whatever. But if you're really curious about Linux Mint, this is worth seeking out. This is a very well-written book. It's not just an introduction to Linux Mint, it's an introduction to Linux. And when I heard this book was going to be published, I jumped right on it and got me a copy. And I really have enjoyed doing it. I just want to point this out, number one, to give Jay a shout, because he's one of my favorite people in the Linux community, but also because Linux Mint is an important distribution of Linux. If you go to distrowatch.com, Linux Mint is at the top of their top 100 list. And it has been for a long, long time. Now, this would lead a lot of people to believe that Linux Mint is more important than Ubuntu or Fedora or any of the other distributions. Well, that's not necessarily true. The DistroWatch Top 100, it only reflects the number of clicks on the site about a distribution. It has nothing to do with how many people use it, and it has nothing to do with the actual popularity of the distribution at large. It's just on that site, and Linux Mint is just sat up there. It doesn't move, and that's because Linux Mint has a community around it that are fiercely loyal to Linux Mint. And I will talk more about my feelings about Linux Mint as this video rolls on, okay? And those guys, they do the clicking, and they also contribute to the project. They give money to Linux Mint and keep it going. And so, therefore, you know, there are those who would argue that Linux Mint is the premier distribution of Linux, especially for new users. And I think that Linux Mint appeals to a certain type of user. I think it appeals to the kind of user that it would be the same person that wanted to go out and buy a relatively powerful car, but they weren't intending to actually, like, drag race it or drive it hard. It's the kind of, you know that kind of person. They have a really nice car and they appreciate the fact that this car can do 200 miles an hour, but they're never going to drive it that fast. They're never going to do it. They want that power, they want that ability, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to use it. And Linux Mint very much falls under that category because it is a very safe distribution of Linux, and it's very reliable. And Linux Mint runs and runs and runs and runs and runs. But I think that the kind of people that actually use it are not the ones that are going to be pushing the edges of what Linux can do. They really are going to be doing email. They're going to be doing the basic things that we do with computers. Maybe a little bit beyond that, but we'll talk about why I feel that way in just a little bit here as we roll along. So let's talk about another thing that makes Linux Mint interesting. Linux Mint comes installed with a bunch of tools that are Mint specific. And as time has rolled on, they have added more to this list, and they have broken away from their Ubuntu base more and more. They do not use the same tools that Ubuntu uses at all. So the first one that we need to talk about came along when they introduced the Cinnamon desktop, and that is this lovely little gem called Nemo. Nemo is one of my favorite file managers, although there is not that much difference between file managers in Linux. It is a very elegant file manager, and it does its job very, very, very well. And it is an integral part of the Cinnamon desktop, and it is. I just love the way it's. First of all, I love the look of it. I love the fact that they give you these underneath the drives here. They give you some idea of how much space is available on the system. There's a lot of little features that are built into Nemo. How much different is it than, let's say, Nautilus or any of the other file managers? I don't know. I never really get into what all these things can do because I use a file manager to find files and click on them, and I use the basic features. So there are those out there watching this video who would be able to break down what is the difference between Nemo and Nautilus and Dolphin and all of the different file managers that are available for Linux. But that is one of the nice things about it that I particularly like is Nemo. Another tool to talk about is the software manager here, and this allows you to install software from the Ubuntu repositories, which Linux Mint is hooked up to because it uses Ubuntu as the base, and also the Linux Mint repositories. And there's a lot of applications in there. One of the things that Linux Mint does is that they will host newer versions of things than what are in the Ubuntu repositories. And so if you install Linux Mint 17.3, you get LibreOffice 5. You don't get LibreOffice 4 point whatever, which is what Ubuntu 14.04 is still on, even though we're pretty much at the end of the cycle now for 17.3 and we're awaiting 18. That's nice. We get some more advanced stuff in here. However, this software manager, as nice of a tool as it is, it does not do some things that, for instance, Ubuntu Mate does, which is one of the reasons that I have really gotten into Ubuntu Mate, and it runs on all my other machines. And that is, they have the Software Boutique. And the Software Boutique is a lovely tool that selects the software that is very much relevant right now if you're running a Linux system. It's not everything that's available in the Ubuntu archives or in the Mate archives. It is just those applications that are very much in demand, and it doesn't really care where the applications come from. When you install something with the Software Boutique, like for instance if you put the Spotify client in there, then it downloads it from Spotify. If you put Google Chrome in there, then it downloads it from Google Chrome. You will not find third-party applications in here. You're going to find the standard applications that are either in the Linux Mint repository or in the Ubuntu repository. And so, therefore, if you want to install third-party applications on Linux Mint, then you have to do it manually. When I installed this particular system that we're talking about, I had to open up a terminal. I had to hook up PPAs. I had to go through all that process. It all worked nicely. Yes, I had to download a deb file for Google Chrome. And as of the recording of this video, Google Chrome has a bug in it where that when you install it, it doesn't get the right public key installed on your system, so then you won't get updates and you get a warning that says the public key is out of date, so then you have to figure out how to go get it yourself. Google has really miffed me since they dropped 32-bit support of Google Chrome, because it seems that every time I turn around there's a new bug that comes up. But that's not important to the video. The point that I'm trying to make here is that in many software management tools now, you can just click on an application and it will install with one click. It's not just in Ubuntu Mate, although I think Ubuntu Mate does it better than anybody else. But anyway, so that's the software. And there's a bunch of other tools we have here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of these other tools that are available in Mint. Here's a good one. This is the backup utility. Not only does this allow you to back up files and folders, but it allows you to back up all of the programs that you have installed in addition to what comes with the Linux Mint distribution. Now this is very useful because what it used to be before Linux Mint 17 came along is that every version of Linux Mint, except for the long-term support versions, they were going to be, you needed to actually reinstall it every like 9 months or so to get the latest version. Now you could choose to stay with an LTS. They changed their model when Ubuntu 17, or rather when Linux Mint 17 came along, Ubuntu 14.04. They decided at that point that from this point forward, all Linux Mint releases that were based on Ubuntu would be based on the long-term support versions. Okay, so we are just now ending the cycle, coming up on ending the cycle here, where Linux Mint is going to be based on Ubuntu 14.04. When they come out with Linux Mint 18, that will be based on Ubuntu 16.04, and it'll be good for another 2 or 3 years. Whether you're going to have to reinstall or not remains to be seen. But the way Linux Mint used to be, that if you wanted to move from release to release, whether it was long-term support or not, the only way to do it was to reinstall. There was no upgrade path. When Linux Mint 17 came along, now we have an upgrade path. So you could put in Linux Mint 17, upgrade to 17.1, then when that was released, 17.2, 17.3, and that was all handled through the update manager. So this tool is less important than it used to be, but it's still very nice, and you can back up all of the programs, a list of the programs that you installed, plus all your files, reinstall the system, and now you can put everything back. So that's a really cool tool. And then we have some simple tools here. They have a USB creator. They have a USB format tool, which is nice because a lot of distributions, the USB format tool is not there. There's not really any easy way to do that. And so you'd have to open like GNOME disks, which I've found to be kind of hit and miss when you're doing USB formatting. Or Gparted. You have to install it on your machine. Use that application. Mint's little USB tool is nice and just allows you to do it. Plus, they allow you to create a startup disk using the Linux Mint startup disk creator there. And before we move on from this screen, one of the things that I have to talk about is the Linux Mint update program. When you install Linux Mint, this runs down in the lovely little panel down there, and this keeps track of all of your updates. Linux Mint is controversial in the Linux community because they do not automatically update system critical packages. They hold back on certain updates that come from upstream Ubuntu or Debian. They will actually hold on to an older version of something or not update it, and they have a ratings system that they use. Okay, so let's see if we have any updates while we're doing this video. Maybe a couple will show up because it's just showing that the system is up to date, but it rates the packages by how secure the Linux Mint developers think they are. So you can have you can set the level at which this will actually update the system, and anything that's considered to be dangerous you're going to have to approve or do manually. And that sort of ruffles the feathers of some of the Linux nerds out there from a security point of view, and I can absolutely totally see what they're talking about. But at the same time, Linux Mint, they're trying to go for being stable. And sometimes some of these updates that come down, they might break something, or the system might work differently. And remember, we're talking about a set of users here who want a really nice system, but they don't really want to fool with it. They're not doing this to tinker. They're doing this to actually have a good experience with their computer. And so I can see it from both sides. And so therefore, It really all depends on what you want to do with your machine. My personal thing about it is that for, like I said, for that kind of user that really just wants a solid experience, if a kernel doesn't get updated, then they may not care. But from a security point of view, and as Linux is getting more and more mainstream, that this is something that they may have to look at. They may have to change how they do that. But for now, it is what it is. So if you like that, whatever. So that's kind of like the state of Linux Mint. It's where it is right now. And like I used to say that Linux Mint was the best thing in the world for new users because of some of these little bugaboos, because of the way the software manager works, and because people automatically, the first thing they ask me is, can I run Spotify? Can I run Netflix? What about the screen capturing software you're using? That's not available in the Mint repositories. That's not a mainstream application, especially on Ubuntu 14.04. It has to be put in through a PPA. And so therefore, if they want access to this, they have to do a manual install. And of course, anybody who comes to Linux at where the technology is right now, they're going to have to learn how to do these things. But Wimpy and the gang over at Ubuntu Mate have tried to take that learning curve and just make it a little less steeper. It's a one-click deal. You can install it. Then you can learn how to do it later or whatever. Or maybe not. You could just run the system. And I'm kind of hoping that when Linux Mint 18 comes along that they might roll some of that technology in there and that we could see this as a trend for a lot of what are supposed to be user-friendly Linux distros, is that this kind of one-click attitude comes along, we will be able to do that. So anyway, let's talk about Linux Mint's future, because we do need to talk about Linux Mint 18, and it is coming up. And they are making some big changes for Linux Mint 18, which they have outlined in this recent Linux Mint blog post. Clem Lefebvre, who is the head developer for Linux Mint, has written an article about this, and he's talking about what's changing. First of all, Linux Mint 18 will include something called XApps. And XApps are very controversial because what they are basically doing is they are taking basic applications that right now come from GNOME, and they are redoing them to avoid certain changes that GNOME has made, because GNOME uses a technology called client-side decorations now. I think this is the big deal about it. A client-side decoration means that you don't have the window border over the top of it. In other words, that top bar can now be active. I've shown that in other videos. So the new GNOME apps with client-side decorations, they don't want to go in that direction for whatever reason. It causes inconsistency on older desktops. But like once again, Martin Wimpress and the gang at Ubuntu Mate, they have integrated that nicely into the Mate desktop experience. So there you go. And the thing is about the XApps is that they are just, we're fragmenting even more. We're making more different apps for a different distribution, and it's like, okay, it kind of, it's like duplication of effort, because once they create these XApps, they are going to have to maintain them, because once you fork an app, it's yours. And it's not like you can just make a few changes and say, okay, well, we're going to take the Pluma text editor from the Mate desktop environment. That's going to become a program called Xed, and they're going to have to maintain that from now on. So it makes me wonder. Now, we're talking about a distribution that came up with the Cinnamon desktop. They already maintain all these tools. They maintain certain Mint applications, or they maintain repositories with applications that change. They modify Firefox before you get it. The Linux Mint version of Firefox has changed quite a bit. Of course, most distributions do that, but they're going to have to keep up with all of this, is the point. So we're going to have to it remains to be seen how that's going to work out. And if we scroll down this page some more, we will get a sneak peek at a new theme that's coming to Linux Mint 18. They plan on changing the desktop theme on the Cinnamon desktop, and this is based on Arc and Mocha, two projects. So they're going to retheme it. It's not going to be the default, I don't think. He talks about, in this article, he talks about not wanting to change things and mess people up too much, but at the same time, I think the way they're going to do it is that the current theme, like what we ordinarily see, is Mint X, and they're going to go to Mint Y. So somewhere down the road, it may become the default theme. And I have not really read everything in this particular blog post, but one of the questions that maybe somebody who's watching this, who's more in tune with what's going on in the Linux Mint world than I am at this point, can tell me, I'm wondering whether Linux Mint 18 is going to use systemd. Because when they did the Debian edition of Linux Mint, they did not choose to adopt systemd, even though Debian had chosen to adopt it. And this was a couple of 3 years ago, and I know that ruffled some feathers. Of course, systemd is very controversial, but Ubuntu 16.04 definitely relies on the systemd initialization sequence, the whole thing there. Now we're talking about deep Linux stuff, so some of you might not care. But I haven't heard a word whether they're going to just go ahead and migrate to systemd. And if they do that, will they do that on the Debian edition as well? Because they did not on the Debian edition. So that remains to be seen. So we've talked about Linux Mint. We've talked about what's coming up with Linux Mint 18. We have the X apps. We have the new look and feel that's going to be available to users. Another thing that's going to change is that in the past, going back to early days of Linux Mint, when you installed it, all of the codecs, the ability to play a DVD, whatever, was good to go. They're not going to do that anymore. What they had been doing is that they were maintaining two versions of the ISO installer, one without codecs and one with codecs. And they have decided they're not going to do that. So what they're going to do is they're going to cut out some of these different versions of Linux Mint that have codecs and don't have codecs. And they are going to now make it so that when you install Linux Mint, in the welcome screen, which I have not shown you, the welcome screen is going to have a button there where you can install the codecs, which is something that I think that they've probably taken from the Ubuntu Mate book of doing things. And speaking of Mate, another thing that is happening with Linux Mint 18 is going to be that they're going to split away with what's going on in the Mate desktop world. The next version of Ubuntu Mate, for instance, is going to be a version which is based on the GTK3 entirely. Whereas Linux Mint has decided for their 18 version that they are going to build the Ubuntu Mate desktop against GTK2. Now this is more plumbing to talk about for a lot of people who wouldn't care. But the difference is that the GTK2 toolkit is the older one, GTK3 is the newer one. GTK3 is used a lot, almost exclusively by GNOME. It does not have to do, it's not necessarily connected with GNOME 3, so don't think that it's like the GNOME Toolkit 3 or whatever. It's something else, the GIMP Toolkit, actually. But they've decided that they're going to do GTK2. And all of these X apps that they're coming along are going to be GTK2 as well. So they're now going against the tide because everybody else is going with GTK3. But they figure that they're going to support this for the next 2 or 3 years, or however long the cycle is for the 18 series. And like I said, I'm not quite sure why they're doing that. I mean, I don't know what the deal is. I don't mind client-side decorations as long as the desktop can render them properly. And but they don't want to do it. They don't want things to change. They want it to keep it to the same paradigm. So we have the codecs not being installed, and they're going to have all of these new applications, which are going to be simplified versions of applications that are already out there. So it makes me wonder how I'm going to like Linux Mint. There's part of me that totally, completely says, yay, let's keep it simple, let's keep it the way it was. And there's another part of me that is very kind of like going, what? Because I'm kind of watching what's going on in the rest of the Linux community. But maybe it could very well be, that Clem is right and everybody else is wrong. And that for the user base that it finds Linux Mint to be super reliable, and they really don't want to push the limits, this may be what they want. And he may be doing something that is the people who are very much involved with the cutting edge of Linux, I have totally disagree with. I watch a lot of podcasts and listen to a lot of what people have to say just to try and keep up with it. And I find myself disagreeing with a lot of what I hear. Because the users that we talk about here at Easy Linux are usually new users, basic users, people who are starting out with Linux or want to use Linux as a daily system. They're not interested in popping the hood and tinkering an awful lot. They just want it to work for them. And maybe that is exactly the user that Clem and the Linux Mint team are going after. And if that's the case, then he may be right and a lot of these other people may be wrong. So we'll have to wait and see. I personally, right now, am enjoying Linux as Ubuntu Mate 16.04 on my other machines. But I'm enjoying using it on this machine as well, because for this particular machine, it does what I need it to do. And so, therefore, as we roll along here, and yes, I do plan on taking a very hard look at Linux Mint 18, and I hope that Clem comes up with an in-place upgrade that one can do, because I really don't want to reinstall this machine. This machine is a hard one to do. So when 18 is released in a couple of months, we'll definitely talk about it. And I just wanted to do this video, and for those of you who are reacting to Linux Mint, what I said about it before in past videos, because like I said, I am concerned about security. They had a security breach. They do not update some packages, and Linux Mint sometimes feels constraining because of that, because you have to try and, especially if you want to get the system to do things like if you'd like to run KDE apps on a Linux Mint system, that's been kind of a hard thing to do, like the Kdenlive video editor or any different KDE based thing. That doesn't work as well. Like on Ubuntu, you can install KDE anything, and it will go get all of the dependencies and all the packages to make that work. But on Linux Mint, it doesn't necessarily do that. And that was a problem that I had with Linux Mint, the 17 series. And one of the reasons that I was so tickled to move on from it and move on to Ubuntu Mate, because in Mate, I have yet to load an application that doesn't work. And in Linux Mint, sometimes some things that you go get, even in the official repos, they don't work real well. So if you start straying away from the Linux Mint vision of what tools you need, sometimes you can run into issues. That's true of most any distro, but more with Linux Mint than a lot of other ones that I've used. So for this computer, Linux Mint is an awesome operating system because this is a basic use machine here. I did lose the ability to do virtualization. I talked about that in the last video. And I'm not really concerned with it. I can do virtualization on 2 other machines. And I kind of want to get away from looking at every Linux distro that comes along anyway. I want to try and concentrate more on Linux lifestyle than be that kind of channel that, oh, something new comes along and we have to do a review of it, that sort of thing. I think people make up their minds about what distros they like and they stick to them. So how much of that, I don't know I'm going to do in the future, but I know for a fact that I will be installing VirtualBox to take a look at Linux Mint 18 when it comes along, and I probably will wait until it is fairly close to official release before I talk about it again. So we'll see how that rolls out. So I just wanted to ramble on a little bit about Linux Mint here for you guys who are Mint users. And I really didn't even talk about the fact that Linux Mint comes with so many desktops available. You can use Cinnamon, you can use the Mate versions. It seems like that those are the main versions of Linux Mint. You have Linux Mint Cinnamon and Linux Mint Mate. And then there's a very nice XFCE version. There is a very nice KDE-based version as well. And, of course, then there's Linux Mint Debian, which I would recommend for somebody who's a little bit more of an advanced user and maybe didn't mind wanting to build some packages from source code on their system, because if you go to the Debian platform, you may have to do that. So there you go. It's kind of a look at Linux Mint, past, present, and future. Where have they been? Where are they going? And my opinions about it as we roll along here. So thank you for watching this. I mean, I know this is a long, rambling video, but it's a lot to talk about. Linux Mint is a big distribution. And I wanted to kind of give my opinion out there because a lot of people are talking about Linux Mint right now. Do check out Easy Linux on the web, check out Easy Linux on Facebook, and check out freedompenguin.com for lots of stories about Linux, the kind of stories that the everyday desktop user of Linux would enjoy. A lot of them show up on freedompenguin.com, so do check that out. We'll do it again soon. Thank you for watching. I do appreciate it.